Hello, my name is Professor Jennifer Kinsley, and today we will be walking through a demonstration of the features of our government and how the law applies to them. For those of you who were political science or government majors, some of the information in this video will be a review, but the information is designed to put all law students on an equal footing to understand our basic structure of government. When we talk about government, there are generally two components. First, the federal government, which covers the entire United States, and then the individual states themselves. We'll start off by talking about the federal government. As you well know, the federal government is governed by the United States Constitution, and the Constitution contains separate articles which set up three different branches of power. First, the legislative branch, which is addressed in Article 1 of the Constitution. Second, the executive branch, which is addressed in Article 2 of the Constitution. And lastly, the judicial branch, which is addressed in Article 3 of the Constitution. Each of the branches of government have separate powers, and they are intended to be a check and balance on one another. We'll start by talking a little bit about the legislative branch. So the basic legislative branch of the United States is Congress, and it is composed of two different houses. First, the House of Representatives, and second, the Senate. The legislature, or Congress, passes the laws in the United States. It is the job of the legislative branch to create the law. Next, we will talk about the executive branch. The executive branch is headed by the President of the United States. It is the job of the executive branch to enforce the laws made by the legislative branch. And then lastly, we will talk about the judicial branch. This is the court system, and it is the job of the federal court system to determine what the federal law is and to apply it. The judiciary in the United States is headed by the United States Supreme Court. There are 9 justices, including the Chief Justice, who comprise the Supreme Court. The justices of the Supreme Court are nominated by the President and approved by the Senate. And justices of the Supreme Court hold the appointment for life. Other than impeachment or retirement or death, they cannot be removed from the court. And this adds to a sense that the Supreme Court acts neutrally, meaning that it is nonpartisan. Underneath the U.S. Supreme Court, there are U.S. Courts of Appeals, and we will talk a little bit about those. Those are the intermediate courts in the United States. And then under them, we have the United States District Courts, which are the trial courts, and some specialty courts, including the U.S. Court of Claims, the U.S. Tax Court, the U.S. Bankruptcy Court, and the Court of International Trade. The federal judicial system is separate from the state judicial systems. All states typically follow a similar pattern to the federal court, meaning that they would have lower state trial courts, some of limited jurisdiction and some of general jurisdiction. Then they have intermediate appellate courts, and then a state court of highest resort, which in most states is referred to as the state Supreme Court. Moving on to the federal judicial circuits. These are the federal courts of appeals. There are 13 different federal circuits in the United States, and they're organized basically by region. We in Northern Kentucky are located within the 6th Circuit, which is actually housed in Cincinnati, Ohio, just across the river from Chase. And you can see on the map how the other circuit courts are clustered around different states and different regions. Of note, the D.C. Circuit has its own Court of Appeals, and the Federal Circuit also has its own Court of Appeals. Next, we will talk about the federal legislative power. So it is important to observe that the Constitution delegates different powers to the federal government than it delegates to the states. Some of the powers that the Constitution vests with the national government include the regulation of interstate commerce, the establishment of foreign policy, the creation and direction of the armed forces, intellectual property law such as copyright and patent, the power to coin money, the power to declare war, the power to admit new states into the Union, the power to create and staff federal courts, the power to establish the post office, and the power to set standard weights and measurements. The powers reserved to the states include the regulation of corporations, the regulation of trade within the state, which is called intrastate commerce, the ability to establish and maintain schools, the regulation of local governments and municipalities, laws about family structure, including marriage and divorce, the power to conduct state elections, and the general power to provide for public safety and welfare. In addition, there are some powers that are shared by the federal government and the states. These include taxation, the ability to charter banks, the ability to borrow money, the administration of the criminal justice system, and the public welfare power. State governments are generally governed by constitutions, just like the federal government. State governments are also governed by state statutes, which are passed by state legislatures, state regulations, which have been promulgated by the state executive, typically through the governor's office, and lastly, state courts. So states typically have a vast system of the judiciary where courts administer justice. In Kentucky, there is a tiered judicial system. Kentucky has 2 trial courts, district courts and circuit courts. The district courts are courts of limited jurisdiction, meaning that they can only resolve certain cases that have been vested to them by the legislature. Things like small claims lawsuits or misdemeanor crimes. Then there are the circuit courts. These are also trial courts of general jurisdiction. They resolve felony cases and civil disputes between companies for major damages. On top of both the district and circuit courts, we have regional courts of appeals in the state of Kentucky. And then lastly, we have a Kentucky Supreme Court, which is the highest court in the state of Kentucky. Ohio follows a similar pattern with some minor changes. Ohio has mayor's courts, which are operated by towns and municipalities throughout the state of Ohio. And these mayor's courts typically are headed by judges or judicial officials who are not actually lawyers. These courts tend to be very informal, and they resolve low-level offenses like speeding tickets. Then there are several different trial courts in Ohio, including the municipal courts, which, like the district courts in Kentucky, have limited jurisdiction to misdemeanors and small claims suits. There are county courts, and there are courts of claims, one court of claims, actually, which resolves lawsuits against the state of Ohio or state entities. Then Ohio also has a trial court called the Court of Common Pleas, and this is a court of largest jurisdiction in the state of Ohio. This court resolves domestic relations claims, juvenile court issues, probate, meaning wills and trusts issues, and then general civil lawsuits between companies or individuals and felony criminal cases. In Ohio, there are 12 courts of appeals, and then the Ohio Supreme Court, which is the supreme highest court in the state of Ohio. Why are we learning about the court system at the beginning of law school? Well, one reason, and a very important reason, is because understanding the structure of the court system helps us understand a concept called precedent. And precedent means that a case was issued by a court that is binding on future courts. This is called mandatory precedent. Understanding the tiered system of courts helps us understand mandatory precedent. The concept here is that a higher court will bind a lower court within the same court system. So the United States Supreme Court, for example, binds all of the courts below it in the federal judicial system. And the Ohio Supreme Court, for example, binds all Ohio courts beneath it in the Ohio court system. Important note here, lower courts cannot bind higher courts, and courts of the same level cannot bind each other. So it's really helpful to think of the court systems as a ladder, and then look at the courts that are above or below the court issuing the precedent. Then we also have a concept called persuasive precedent. And this is where a court issues a decision that is not binding on lower courts, but could be considered in helping the court reach a decision. For example, a decision reached by the Ohio Supreme Court is not mandatory precedent on the Kentucky Supreme Court because those are two separate judicial systems. But the Ohio Supreme Court might consider as persuasive precedent or persuasive authority a decision issued by the Kentucky Supreme Court. We also want to look briefly at sources of law. There are two general sources: primary sources and secondary sources. Primary sources of law are the actual law. These are documents or statutes or regulations that actually set forth legal rights and responsibilities. Things like the Constitution, the state constitutions, administrative regulations issued by the federal or state government, statutes passed by the legislative branch, and cases issued from the judicial branch are primary sources of law. These are the actual law. Then we also have secondary sources. Secondary sources are not the law, but they help us understand the law, and they explain what the law is. These are things like law review articles or encyclopedias or treatises that individuals have written about the law to help us understand it. It's important to know the difference because a secondary source does not set forth any legal rights or responsibilities. Only primary sources do that. I hope this review of our structure of government and our structure of the courts has been helpful to you. If you have any questions about the government, the court system, the legislative branch, or the executive branch, please feel free to email me at kinsleyj1@nku.edu or bring your questions with you to the first day of labs. Thank you for watching this video, and we look forward to seeing you soon.